A bus ride turns into a powerful showdown when a woman refuses to back down against a racist bus driver. Will she spark a revolution? Watch this unforgettable battle for justice unfold. The bus groaned to a stop on a busy downtown street, its doors hissing open to the morning chill. Commuters shuffled in, bundled in coats and scarves, preparing for another hectic day in the city. Among them was Evelyn Carter, a woman in her early 70s with a dignified posture and an air of quiet determination. Her neatly pressed suit and a leather purse clutched in her hand spoke of a lifetime of grace under pressure. She stepped onto the bus, the rhythmic sound of her heels clicking softly on the floor as she paid her fare. Robert Witman, the bus driver, barely glanced at her as she dropped her coins into the fare box. His frown deepened, his scowl reflecting his usual mood. "Hurry it up," he barked, his tone cutting through the bustling air of the morning. Evelyn didn't respond to the snap, merely adjusting her balance before moving toward an empty seat near the front. But before she could settle, Whitman's voice cracked the air again, sharp and commanding. "Not there," he snapped, his words loud enough to silence the hum of the bus. Evelyn paused, her back straight, her calm face turning to meet his eyes. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice steady, though her patience was beginning to fray. Whitman's lips curled into a sneer as he repeated, "You don't sit there. The front's not for you. Move to the back." A hush fell over the passengers, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to freeze. Evelyn, unfazed, met his glare with a level gaze of her own. "I've paid my fare," she replied, voice clear and unwavering. "I'll sit where I please." Whitman's face reddened, his fury mounting as he slammed the brakes, causing the bus to lurch. Passengers gasped, reaching for poles and seats to steady themselves. Witman stood up from his driver's seat, a towering figure, pointing a finger at Evelyn. "Either you move to the back, or you're off this bus. Your choice." His words cut through the air, loaded with a bitter, racial charge that no one on board dared confront. Until now. Evelyn's gaze remained locked on his, unflinching. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. The bus was eerily quiet now, the air thick with tension. Evelyn stood motionless, her feet firmly planted on the worn floor, her shoulders squared with determination. Around her, the other passengers avoided eye contact, some casting furtive glances at the scene unfolding before them. The sound of the engine hummed softly, but it felt deafening in the charged silence. Robert Whitman's face was flushed with anger, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He stared at Evelyn as if she were the source of all his frustration. His voice, when it came, was sharp and grating, slicing through the thick silence. "I told you, move to the back," he growled, taking a threatening step forward. Evelyn didn't flinch. She met his gaze with quiet, unwavering resolve. "I paid my fare, just like everyone else on this bus," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the growing frustration in her chest. "I'll sit where I choose." Whitman's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, his tone dripping with contempt. "You think you're special? You think you can just sit wherever you want?" His words were laced with sneer, a quiet but dangerous threat hanging in the air. "I make the rules here, lady. You want to cause trouble? You'll see what happens." The murmur of the other passengers grew louder, their discomfort evident. The young woman in the back, clutching her toddler, pulled him closer, her eyes darting between Evelyn and the driver. An elderly man in a suit shifted uncomfortably, the sound of his newspaper crinkling breaking through the tension. A teenage girl whispered, though just loud enough for the whole bus to hear, "This is ridiculous." Evelyn's heart raced, but she refused to show fear. She had seen this before, the unearned authority, the casual dismissal of her rights. But she wasn't backing down. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice firm now, carrying the weight of a lifetime of quiet resistance. "I've done nothing wrong. You can't treat people like this." Whitman's hand shot out, pointing toward the back of the bus with an exaggerated, forceful gesture. His body was tense with rage, but there was something else, something underneath the anger, a fear of losing control. "Move to the back now," he ordered again, his words clipped, almost desperate. But Evelyn, who had faced far worse than this in her long life, stood tall. "I'm not your problem," she said quietly, her voice soft but brimming with a quiet power that made the words sting. "You are." As the bus idled on the busy street, the tension between the two of them was palpable. The passengers, once silent observers, now began to stir, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the unease bubbling to the surface. They were witnessing something far beyond a simple bus ride. The moment had taken on a life of its own, and Evelyn knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been pushed aside, told they didn't belong, or forced to shrink themselves to fit someone else's idea of what was right. Evelyn's eyes scanned the passengers, her gaze steady and unwavering. "This isn't just about me," she said, louder now, her words carrying the weight of years of injustice. "It's about what's right." The bus was still, suspended in a moment where every breath seemed to count. Robert Witman stood glaring at Evelyn, his grip tightening on the steering wheel, knuckles white. The sirens of an approaching police car grew louder, but still, he didn't move. It was as though time had stopped, and the entire bus had become a stage for something far larger than any of them could have expected. Outside the windows, people were beginning to gather, drawn to the scene by the growing murmurs from inside the bus. The crowd was just beyond the doors, watching, waiting. The energy on the street was palpable, a shift in the air. Passengers, once silent or uncertain, were starting to take sides. The quiet whispers of support for Evelyn were growing louder, inching their way toward collective defiance. "Why are you doing this?" Evelyn's voice was calm, though there was an unmistakable fire behind her words. "What exactly do you think you're going to accomplish by humiliating me on this bus?" Whitman scoffed, his frustration reaching a boiling point. "You're making a scene, lady. You think you can just sit where you please like you own this place." His voice was getting louder, more erratic, but Evelyn's composure was unshaken. Her eyes locked with his, steady and unflinching. "You're the one making a scene," she replied, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'm just sitting here, waiting for my ride. You're the one who's trying to turn this into something it's not." The bus driver clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as his eyes darted around, now fully aware of the passengers watching, their faces filled with a mix of confusion, anger, and reluctant agreement. The young man who had been recording the entire incident on his phone stood up, his voice ringing out over the tension. "This isn't just about her," he said, holding his phone high. "This is about all of us. If you let him treat her like this, what's next? What happens when it's someone else?" The question hung in the air, the words resonating deeper than anyone could have predicted. The murmurs from the back of the bus became louder, some passengers shifting in their seats, others standing up, now emboldened by the growing support. The collective sense of right and wrong had shifted. The room, once filled with silence, was now alive with whispers of dissent, like a spark that had set afire. A woman in her 40s near the front stood and turned to Whitman, her voice firm. "You can't treat people like this. Not anymore." Her words cut through the bus like a knife. "She has every right to sit where she wants." Whitman looked around, the weight of the passengers' eyes on him. He had always been in control, the authority on the bus. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he had the power he thought he did. His face reddened, his breaths coming in short, sharp bursts. "We've had enough of this," the young man who'd recorded the video said, his phone still raised high. "You're not above the law, and neither is she." The moment hung in the air, suspended, and Evelyn, still standing with poise, knew that the battle for what was right wasn't just about her, but for everyone who had ever been told to step back, stay down, and accept what they were given. With the crowd outside now chanting, "Let her sit," the weight of history seemed to shift, and with it, the balance of power on the bus began to tilt. Robert Whitman finally took a step back, his face a mask of defeat, but it was clear. Evelyn had won, and the fight wasn't over. The crowd outside was swelling, their voices growing louder with each chant, their collective power seeping into the bus like a tide. Evelyn smiled slightly, her voice steady and strong as she turned to the officers now approaching. "This isn't over yet," she said softly, her words carrying the weight of everything that had been said and unsaid up to this point. "But I'm not leaving until I know this won't happen to anyone else." The bus rumbled to life as the officers boarded, and for the first time, the passengers felt like they were no longer mere witnesses. They were part of a movement. The tension inside the bus was thick enough to cut with a knife. As Robert Witman stood there, his jaw clenched, his fists shaking at his sides, Evelyn Carter remained a pillar of calm at the front of the bus. Her eyes, steady as ever, locked onto his, unwavering in her quiet defiance. The murmurs of the passengers grew louder, the low hum of uncomfortable voices rising like a storm on the horizon. Witman let her sit. One voice called from the back of the bus, emboldened by the stillness of the moment. The words seemed to echo in the space, stirring something in the air. It wasn't just the passengers who were watching now. The crowd outside had gathered, their faces pressed against the windows, eyes wide with curiosity and growing outrage. Whitman's face flushed a deep crimson, and his teeth ground together as his gaze darted across the faces of passengers. The young man with the phone stood up, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You're causing a scene, and it's all on you, man. Just let her sit." The words stung more than Evelyn had expected. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them, all the people who had sat quietly through indignities and small injustices, waiting for someone else to act. And now, as the chant "let her sit" rose outside the bus, a shift had occurred. Evelyn straightened her back even more, standing taller in the face of Whitman's fury. "I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Witman," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This isn't just about me. It's about how we treat each other, how we treat all people." The tension swelled as a woman in her 40s, sitting a few rows behind, stood and spoke up. "You don't have the right to tell anyone where they can sit," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "We all paid our fare. We all deserve respect." Her words ignited a spark, and others followed her lead. The teenage girl who had been silently watching from the back of the bus now stood, her voice shaking with emotion, but gaining strength with each word. "We've had enough of this," she said. "She's not doing anything wrong. Why are you making a fuss?" Whitman's face twisted in frustration, his hand gripping the wheel as he tried to maintain control. "She's disrupting the bus," he growled, his voice thick with venom. "I'm just trying to do my job." "Your job?" Evelyn's words were sharp, almost amused. "If your job is to discriminate, then I don't want any part of it." The bus was alive with voices now, the energy shifting from uneasy silence to loud, unwavering solidarity. Whitman's frustration boiled over. "If anyone doesn't like it, get off my bus," he yelled, but no one moved. The young man with the phone grinned. "Not happening. You're the one who's about to get off." A smile played at the corner of Evelyn's lips. She wasn't just sitting in that seat. She was standing up for something much larger. And for the first time that morning, she wasn't alone. As the crowd outside the bus continued to grow, their chant growing louder and more unified, Robert Witman stood at the front, red-faced and shaking with barely contained anger. His eyes darted around the bus, seeking an escape, but the passengers weren't backing down. The realization was beginning to set in. He was losing control. What had started as a simple power play, a small moment of dominance, was quickly turning into something far more significant. Evelyn remained seated, her eyes calm and unwavering, as if she were watching the world unfold from a distant shore. She was no longer the only one fighting. The energy in the bus had shifted. One by one, the passengers were standing up, not physically, but with their voices, their presence. The young man with the phone, who had been recording the entire incident, stood taller now, his words more assertive. "You can't keep doing this," he called out, his voice strong and defiant. "This is a public space. She's allowed to sit wherever she wants." A man in a suit near the back of the bus spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "I've been watching this for years," he said, his gaze never leaving the back of Whitman's head. "And I've been silent, thinking it didn't matter. But it matters now. What you're doing, this isn't just wrong, it's ridiculous." The teenage girl, who had been silent at first, now stood up, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "It's 2025, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Why are we still doing this? Why is this still happening?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Whitman's anger faltered. His hand trembled as he gripped the wheel, trying to steady himself, but his voice was raw, tinged with the desperation of someone trying to maintain control of a situation spiraling out of his reach. "You people don't get it," Witman growled. "I'm just trying to do my job. I don't have to deal with this." "Your job—" Evelyn's voice was low but cutting. "Your job is to serve the public, not bully them. You failed at your job today." The passengers around her began murmuring their agreement. The young woman holding her toddler squeezed her child's hand, her voice quiet but determined as she added, "You're not doing your job. You're creating problems." And then it happened. A woman in her 50s, her voice steady and resolute, stood up from her seat in the middle of the bus. "I've seen enough," she said. "I'm not staying quiet anymore. It's time for this nonsense to stop." As the bus grew quiet, the weight of her words hit everyone like a wave. The power had shifted. The passengers weren't just spectators. They were participants in this moment. No longer would they remain passive. Evelyn's gaze swept across the bus, taking in the faces of the passengers, now standing with her in spirit. Her voice rang out clearly, filling the space. "This isn't just about me," she said, her words steady but carrying the weight of a hard-earned conviction. "This is about all of us. If we don't stand up now, who will?" The silence that followed was brief, but it spoke volumes. The noise outside the bus had become a chorus, a rhythmic chant that rang through the open doors. "Let her sit, let her sit." With each repetition, it grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the very walls of the bus were vibrating with the collective power of the crowd. Robert Whitman's face, which had once been flushed with fury, now seemed drained, his eyes darting nervously as the situation continued to spiral out of control. Inside the bus, the passengers, who had been silent witnesses moments before, were no longer just bystanders. Their collective silence had given way to quiet defiance, and now, it seemed as though the entire bus had become a united front. They were all complicit now, whether they had spoken up or not. They had become part of this moment, a living testament to the power of standing together in the face of injustice. Evelyn sat poised, her back straight, hands clasped neatly in her lap. She didn't need to speak any longer. Her mere presence had become the embodiment of resistance, a symbol that had inspired others to act. She could feel the shift in the air around her, the subtle yet unmistakable power that comes when a single person's courage sparks something much bigger than themselves. A woman standing near the back of the bus, her hair tied back in a practical ponytail, cleared her throat. "We're not getting off this bus," she said, her voice cutting to the tension like a hot knife. "If you think we're going to let him treat her like this, you're wrong." Her words hung in the air, and in that moment, the passengers' collective was forged into something unbreakable. The bus had become a battleground, but now, it wasn't just Evelyn fighting alone. It was everyone together. Witman, realizing his power had slipped through his fingers, tried to regain control, but the words fell hollow. "I'm doing my job," he muttered, almost pleading, his voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "No," a man in a suit replied firmly, his voice steady but unwavering. "You're abusing your authority, and that's not your job." As the officer arrived, he surveyed the scene before stepping onto the bus. He could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, the tension radiating from every corner. The silence that followed felt like a warning, the pressure mounting with each passing second. "Ma'am," the officer said softly, his voice surprisingly calm, "we need to resolve this without further escalation. Please, just move to another seat." Evelyn's eyes locked onto his, unwavering and calm. "I'm not the one escalating the situation," she replied. "He is. He's the one making a fuss over nothing. I've done nothing wrong." The officer hesitated. He glanced back at Witman, then at the passengers, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of expectation and judgment. The crowd outside had grown louder, their voices now joined by the steady rhythm of clapping. This wasn't just about one woman's right to sit where she wanted. This was about all of them. The passengers, the people who had remained silent for too long. They had finally found their voices. And no matter what happened next, they were no longer going to let injustice go unchecked. The officer nodded slowly, his face a mix of frustration and realization. "You're right," he said, finally addressing Witman. "This needs to be handled better. We're moving forward with this properly, The shift in power had been completed. The bus, once a symbol of division, now stood as a testament to unity and defiance against authority gone wrong. The minutes felt like hours as Evelyn sat, unflinching, under the harsh gaze of Robert Witman. The bus, which had once been a routine part of her day, now felt like a stage for a drama she could never have predicted. She could hear the crowd outside growing louder, their chants swelling in volume, their energy feeding off each other. The police sirens were getting closer, but Evelyn knew the real fight wasn't just about the authorities coming to the scene. It was about what was happening on that bus. The tension inside the vehicle was palpable, each second heavier than the last. Whitman's face was contorted, his lips twisted into a sneer that barely hid his boiling anger. He tried to stand taller, trying to regain his sense of control, but it was clear his authority was slipping through his fingers. His attempt to bark orders fell flat. "You all better get off now if you don't want to get stuck in this mess," he shouted, though there was less conviction in his voice this time. The passengers remained in place. No one moved. Evelyn's hands remained folded in her lap, her posture calm but resolute. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her. The young man who had started filming, the elderly woman who had whispered support earlier, the mother with a toddler clutching her side. Every person on this bus was a witness to this moment, and they weren't going to let it slip away unnoticed. "You really want to turn this into a circus, Witman?" A voice from the back of the bus called out. It was a young man in his 20s, his eyes steely with determination as he stood up, placing himself between Evelyn and the bus driver. The crowd had started to gather outside, and his presence seemed to command the space. "She's not going anywhere. We've all seen enough of this." The man's voice carried with it the weight of truth, and as he spoke, the other passengers seemed to find their voices. The whispers grew louder, becoming words of encouragement, of defiance, of unity. A voice from the middle of the bus chimed in. "You can't treat people like that and expect us to stay silent." Witman turned sharply to the young man, his face flushed with humiliation. "Stay out of this, kid. This is none of your business." But his words lacked power. Hanging limply in the air, swallowed by the mounting energy of the crowd, Evelyn's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "This is everyone's business, Robert," she said, her voice cutting through the rising noise. "You just don't want to face it." Outside, the crowd had grown larger, people with phones in hand and signs that read, "End the hate and let her sit." The sight of the growing crowd outside only added fuel to the fire, transforming this confrontation from a small incident into something far more significant. Whitman's shoulders slumped as the reality of the situation hit him. This wasn't just a routine bus ride. It was a turning point, a moment where the voices of many could no longer be ignored. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel in frustration, but the sound barely registered as the bus sat, still and tense, with no escape for him. His outburst had done nothing but fuel the fire. "We're not backing down," the young man said with finality, his words solidifying the resolve of everyone on the bus. "You can keep shouting, but this isn't about you anymore." The officer finally stepped aboard, the doors hissing as they opened. He took one look at the scene. The passengers, the young man standing resolutely in front of Evelyn, and the driver whose face had gone pale, and immediately knew this was not something to ignore. Evelyn, who had fought for herself and for others for years, now found the tide was turning. She didn't need to say anything more. She didn't need to convince anyone. Her stance, her composure, and the unity of the passengers had already done that for her. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and it was no longer just about sitting on a bus. It was about standing up for what was right. The bus was filled with a new kind of energy now, one of shared purpose and hope. Even the smallest voices had found their strength, and for the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt a quiet sense of triumph. No longer was she just a passenger on this bus. She had become a symbol of change, of courage, and of the undeniable power of standing together against injustice. The sirens outside the bus grew louder, cutting through the oppressive silence within the vehicle. But instead of panic, there was a palpable sense of anticipation. The crowd outside had swelled, their chants echoing in the street. "Let her sit! Let her sit!" Evelyn Carter's shoulders remained squared, her posture as resolute as ever. She had seen enough of injustice in her life to recognize when something had to change, Today wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been pushed aside, ignored, or mistreated. As the bus stood still, the passengers' hushed whispers turned into quiet murmurs of support. Some, like the young man recording, were documenting the event for posterity. Others simply waited, their solidarity ringing louder than any words could. The driver, Robert Witman, paced behind the wheel, his face twisted with frustration and fury. His earlier outburst seemed to fall flat now, leaving him standing in front of an audience who was no longer afraid to stand against him. Evelyn could feel the tension shift. It was as if the weight of the moment had finally broken something within him. The officer had arrived, stepping aboard with a sense of urgency. His eyes immediately assessed the situation. Evelyn seated with dignity, Whitman standing in the doorway, his fists clenched. The crowd outside had only grown, their faces a mix of concern and hope. Even though the officer hadn't yet spoken, the air between them thickened with the unspoken understanding. This wasn't going to be easy. "You need to step aside, sir," the officer said, his voice measured but firm. "This is a public transport issue. Let's not make this any worse." Whitman was taken aback, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered, but it was a weak defense. The officer looked at him blankly. "No," the officer replied. "You're not. You're harassing someone who's done nothing wrong. That's not your job." He turned his gaze toward Evelyn. "Ma'am, you got every right to sit where you please." Evelyn's gaze softened just slightly. She nodded, her hands resting calmly on her lap. "Thank you," she said simply. The small, quiet victory of those words was enough to spark a ripple of relief among the passengers. But it wasn't over. The moment was shifting. The winds were changing. Whitman stood in stunned silence, his defiance melting into something more akin to panic. His bravado had dissolved under the weight of Evelyn's quiet strength and the power of the crowd's unwavering support. Outside, the chant had become deafening. "Let her sit! Let her sit!" The voices had grown stronger, more determined. The officer guided Whitman off the bus, his voice harsh now as he delivered a few terse commands. "I'm placing you under arrest for misconduct. You're not fit to be working here." Evelyn sat back, taking in a slow, deliberate breath. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The power of collective action, the strength of unity, had turned the tide. As the bus doors closed, the passengers shared a collective breath. They were witnesses to something greater than an individual act of defiance. They were part of something larger than themselves. The energy in the air was one of triumph, of a small but significant victory for justice. The bus slowly started moving again, the hum of the engine steadying the rattled nerves of its passengers. Evelyn smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the young man who had filmed it all. He caught her eye and gave her a thumbs up. Her voice, calm and steady, broke the quiet. "Thank you, all of you," she said, her words carrying the weight of experience and gratitude. The passengers, once hesitant and quiet, now seemed emboldened. The young woman sitting across from Evelyn leaned forward, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I've never seen anything like that," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You're amazing." Evelyn smiled, but her eyes remained focused. "It's not about being amazing," she said. "It's about standing up when it counts." The bus continued down its route, and for the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt a sense of quiet pride. This was her victory, but more importantly, it was a victory for everyone who had stood by her, silently or loudly. Together, they had sparked something that would not be easily extinguished. As the bus rolled forward, the city outside seemed a little brighter, the people a little braver. The fight for justice, it seemed, was just beginning. In the days following the incident on the bus, the city seemed to be holding its breath. Everywhere Evelyn went, people whispered her name. Some offered congratulations, others just silent nods of respect. The viral video of the confrontation had shaken the very core of their community. But it wasn't just about the video. It was about the way the system had failed, and how one woman's quiet strength had turned that failure on its head. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, her coffee cup cradled between her hands. The morning sun filtered softly through the window, casting a warm light across the worn wood. She thought about the events of the past week, the anger, the fear, the small but important victory. But as she sat there, she realized something. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what needed to happen next. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Angela, the young woman who had helped Evelyn navigate the aftermath. Angela's smile was bright as she stepped into the kitchen, handing Evelyn a small envelope. "I thought you should see this," Angela said, her voice warm but filled with anticipation. Evelyn opened the envelope, unfolding the letter inside. It was from the city's transit authority, addressed to her personally. Her eyes scanned the words, and as she read, her face softened. It was an official apology. The letter acknowledged the mistreatment she had endured, the pattern of discrimination that had existed far too long, and most importantly, the steps they intended to take to ensure this never happened again. They were implementing a new training program for all bus drivers, focused on diversity, de-escalation, and respect. But there was more. The transit authority had also agreed to a public forum, where residents could voice their concerns and hold the leadership accountable. Angela was watching her closely. "So, what do you think?" Evelyn placed the letter on the table, her hand steady but her heart pounding. She knew this was just the beginning, that real change would take time. But in that moment, she felt the weight of the lesson that had unfolded before her. She had stood up. She had refused to back down. And now, the system was responding. "This," Evelyn said, her voice steady and filled with resolve, "this is just a start. It's not about one moment. It's about making sure no one ever has to face what I did again. It's about showing up every day, even when it feels like nothing will change." Angela nodded, a proud smile on her face. "I think we're going to see more change than you realize. It's already happening." Evelyn took a deep breath, the weight of the lesson settling in her chest. "The real lesson," she said slowly, "is that change doesn't happen when you wait for someone else to do it. It happens when you take that first step, even if you don't know what will come next. And sometimes that step is all it takes to start a revolution." As she looked out the window, Evelyn saw a group of people gathered on the sidewalk below. They were holding signs, their faces lit with hope. It was then that Evelyn realized the revolution wasn't just happening in the courtroom, on the bus, or in city meetings. It was happening in the hearts of the people. And for the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt like the world was moving towards something better. The trial had come and gone, and with it, the decision that Evelyn had been waiting for. The courtroom was no longer a place of tension for her, but a symbol of what had been accomplished, of how her unwavering stance had transformed a small moment into a lasting lesson for everyone involved. The guilty verdict for Robert Witman, the bus driver who had wrongfully harassed her, was a victory, but was far from an end. The system had been held accountable, but now it was time for Evelyn to turn her attention to the future. She sat quietly in her office that afternoon, the sun filtering through the blinds and casting long shadows on the wooden floor. The weight of the case, the long fight, and the national attention were still heavy on her shoulders. But in her heart, Evelyn knew that this wasn't just about one man's actions. It had never been. It was about changing an entire culture, one small act of courage at a time. Her phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting her thoughts. It was Angela, her voice quick and excited over the line. "Evelyn, I just got off the phone with the mayor's office. They're organizing a community-wide summit, and they want you to speak." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, the edge of a smile creeping onto her face. "A summit? For what?" "They're looking to build on the momentum from the trial. They want to discuss police reform, discrimination, and the steps the city is taking to ensure something like this never happens again. And they want you to headline it." Evelyn's heart swelled. She had known, deep down, that this fight was never just about one bus driver. She had known that for true change to happen, it would take more than a court case, more than a trial. It would take the community standing together and holding everyone accountable. "I'll do it," Evelyn said, her voice firm with resolve. "But this isn't just my victory. It's everyone's. And I'll be sure to remind them of that." The next morning, Evelyn stood before a packed auditorium, the buzz of the crowd filling the room with an electric energy. As she took the stage, the applause was overwhelming. But she stood tall, her composure the very picture of quiet strength. She looked out over the sea of faces, community leaders, local activists, everyday citizens, and she realized just how much had changed. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had been silenced for too long. The lesson here, Evelyn began, her voice steady and clear, is that change doesn't come from waiting. It doesn't come from letting someone else handle it. It comes from standing up, even when it's hard. It comes from speaking out, even when you're the only one doing it. The audience listened, rapt and attentive, as Evelyn spoke about the steps needed to prevent discrimination, how it wasn't enough to simply say things had changed, but that the work had to continue every day. She spoke about the importance of having uncomfortable conversations, even when it felt easier to turn away. And most importantly, she continued, we must never forget that justice isn't just for the few, it's for everyone. The room erupted in applause once more, louder this time, and Evelyn knew she had made a difference. She had done more than win a case. She had ignited a movement, one that would carry on long after the lights of the trial had dimmed. As she stepped off the stage, Angela met her with a grin. You did it, she said. Evelyn smiled, the weight of the past few weeks lifting off her shoulders. No, we did it. Together. And with that, she walked into a future filled with promise, knowing the lessons she had learned would continue to shape not just her life, but the lives of countless others.